It's Easter, time to celebrate. But what if we don't feel like celebrating? There are some of us who are doing it pretty tough right now. We're facing significant challenges. Some of us are grieving, dealing with health issues, relational challenges, you name it. Sure, it's Easter, but what if we just don't feel up to celebration? We know we're supposed to be celebrating, but what if the best we can do is drag ourselves out of bed on Easter morning and come to church? Life for some of us is pretty dark right now. We're going to look at John's telling of the resurrection story. John begins early on the first day of the week, whilst it was still dark. It was dark, all right. Mark's Gospel tells us that the sun was rising, but John wants us to know that it's still dark. John introduced the idea of darkness at the very beginning of his Gospel. Jesus is the light of the world. His Gospel opens with the light shining into the darkness, and the darkness is not able to overcome it. On that first Easter morning, things were about as dark as they could get for Mary. 2 days early, she'd watched as they hung Jesus on the cross to be crucified. She'd watched them take down his broken body and place it in the tomb. It wasn't only the broken body of Jesus they buried that day. Along with him, they buried all of Mary's hopes, all of her dreams, all of her future. Jesus had made such a difference in her life, but now it was over. He was gone. Things were so dark, and whilst it's still dark, she finds herself walking to the tomb to pay her respects to a corpse. On arriving at the tomb, however, Mary was in for a deep shock. The stone they'd rolled across the entrance of the tomb had been removed. At this stage, you might expect Mary to sing out praises. Jesus has risen. But remember, this is the first Easter. She doesn't know how the story goes. She can only assume the worst, the obvious, foul play. So she runs to Simon, Peter, and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and she says, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." So how dark are things feeling now? As if the crucifixion wasn't enough. Now his body's missing. It's so dark. So Peter and the other disciple started out for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and believed. What did he believe? Did he believe that Jesus had risen from the dead, or that the body had been stolen? Remember, this is the first Easter. John tells us in parenthesis that they still didn't understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. It's still dark. What are they supposed to do? What would you do? Then the disciples went back to where they were staying, but they left Mary behind at the tomb. I wonder, when John was writing this story, why didn't he just tell his readers, "It's not really dark at all. Jesus is alive. You just don't know it yet"? Maybe John knows, like we've experienced, that even after Jesus rose from the dead, things can still be dark. So Mary stands outside the tomb crying, and as she weeps, she bends over to look into the tomb, and she saw 2 angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head, one at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They've taken my Lord away," she said. "I don't know where they've put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't realize it was Jesus. "Woman," he said, "why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've put him. I will go and get him." And then Jesus said to her, "Mary." He called her by name. At once Mary recognizes him. "Rabboni," she calls out, "Rabbi, teacher." Jesus said, Don't touch me, but go and tell my brothers what you've seen." So through the darkness, Mary hurries back to the disciples and tells them, "I have seen the Lord." Is it still dark? Well, in some ways it still is, but one thing has changed. Mary can now say, "I have seen the Lord." I'd like to tell you that because Jesus has risen, we won't experience any more darkness. But I can't, because it's not true. It was still dark when God moved the stone. It was dark as Jesus rose from the dead. It was still dark as Mary walked to the tomb. Some 6 weeks later, when Jesus ascended into heaven, there was still darkness in the world. People would still get sick. People would still die. They'd still struggle in their relationships. They were still under the Roman oppression. But one thing had changed forever. Jesus was alive. They'd seen him. They'd heard him call their name. He's calling your name too. Here are some questions to ponder. Sit with them. Discuss them amongst yourselves. Share them in your small groups. How do you find yourself responding to the idea that even after we've celebrated Easter, even when we know that Jesus is alive, in many ways it's still dark? How have you experienced darkness in your life? Are you struggling with darkness right now? What about those you know, those you love? What are they having to deal with? What difference does your understanding and experience of Easter make as you journey through life's different circumstances? How well do you know the risen Jesus? In spite of whatever challenges you might be facing, can you say, like Mary, that you have seen the Lord? Have you heard him calling your name? As we once again reflect on the glorious story of Easter, is there something you need to be doing? Someone you need to be speaking to?